What if I told you that perfect deep hole you've been fishing for years is a fish ghost town? That the advice your grandpa gave you, the one thing every ice fisherman seems to know, is the very reason your flags aren't flying? We're talking about the most common flag-killing mistake in tip-up fishing, setting them at the wrong depth. Stay with me, because in this video, I'm going to show you why those deep spots are often the worst places to be. The reason has to do with something invisible but more important than bait: oxygen. This isn't just a theory, it's a hard truth of winter lakes that could completely change your success rate. So let me ask you, what's the first thing you do when you hit a new lake in winter? Head for the deepest spot, right? Let me know in the comments. For generations, the old wisdom has been passed down. You can almost hear it echoing across the frozen lake. In winter, fish go deep and slow. It makes sense on the surface. Deeper water is more stable. It's a refuge from the chaos on top. So we follow the rule. We get out there on a cold morning, fire up the auger, and we punch holes in 40, 50, even 60 feet of water. We do it because that's what we were taught. It's become a habit, an automatic response to a frozen lake. But here's the problem. Lakes aren't static. They are living, breathing ecosystems that change dramatically under the ice. That safe, deep water from November can become a toxic, lifeless trap by January. And by blindly following that old rule, we're setting up for failure before our first bait is even in the water. Let's start by attacking this myth head-on, the deep water myth. Why do we believe it so strongly? Because we think of depth as safety. For a fish, deeper water means protection from overhead predators like eagles and ospreys. It also offers more stable temperatures, away from the freezing surface. In the open water seasons, this is often true. The biggest fish are frequently found holding on deep structures. But under a thick sheet of ice and a blanket of snow, the game changes completely. The rules are different. Safety is no longer just about hiding from a bird. In the dead of winter, safety means finding water you can actually breathe in. And that water, more often than not, is not in the deepest part of the lake. We need to erase the old rule and write a new one based on the real currency of winter survival. The real winter killer isn't the cold, it's the lack of oxygen. Think about it. Once the lake freezes over, it's sealed off from the atmosphere. There's no wind to mix the water, and no new oxygen getting in from the air. At the same time, you have decades of dead leaves, weeds, and muck on the bottom. All winter long, this stuff is decaying, and that process of decomposition uses up enormous amounts of dissolved oxygen. Where does this happen the most? In the deepest, most stagnant parts of the lake basin. The water down there becomes anoxic, meaning it has little to no oxygen. Fish are smart. They will not stay in an area where they are slowly suffocating. They will actively abandon these zones, no matter how safe they seem. Your bait is useless if the fish can't even live there. I want you to visualize this. Picture the lake's basin like a big bowl. Down at the very bottom of that bowl is a thick layer of muck. As winter goes on, that decaying muck creates a creeping, invisible cloud of bad water. This is the dead zone. It might start at 40 feet deep in December, but by February, that line could have risen to 25 or even 20 feet. There is a very real, very sharp line, called a thermocline, and in this case, an oxycline. Below that line, there is simply no life. You could have the liveliest, most expensive shiner in the world, but if you lower it past that invisible line, it's like dangling a steak in a vacuum-sealed room. The fish aren't ignoring it. They literally are not there. They can't be. This is the reality we're up against every time we drill a hole in a deep spot without thinking. To understand why this happens, you have to know a little about a lake's turnover. In the fall, as the surface water cools, it becomes denser and sinks. This sinking water pushes the bottom water up, causing the whole lake to mix. This event is critical because it distributes oxygen from the surface all the way to the bottom, essentially charging up the lake for winter. But once that ice cap forms, the mixing stops completely. The lake is now living on a fixed budget of oxygen, and the biggest expense on that budget is the decomposition happening in the deep. Every day, the oxygen levels in the basin get a little lower. It's a ticking clock. Early in the season, right after the first ice, the deep spots might still be productive because there's plenty of oxygen left over from the turnover, but as the weeks go by, that budget runs out. Now, let's talk about the food. The big predators we're after, like pike and walleye, are slaves to their stomachs. They go where the food is. So, if the deep water is becoming an oxygen-deprived wasteland, where do you think the baitfish are? They're not hanging around to suffocate. Shiners, perch, bluegills, and all the other forage fish are the first to leave. They are much more sensitive to low oxygen levels than the larger predators. They will move up in the water column or migrate to shallower areas of the lake where conditions are better. The predators have no choice but to follow them. So when you're setting your tip-ups deep, you're not just in a place with no oxygen, you're in a place with no food. You've completely missed the entire food chain, which has relocated to survive. So where do they go? One of the best places to look is for green weeds. Yes, even under the ice, some types of weeds, like coontail or milfoil, can remain green and photosynthesize on sunny days. It's not much, but they produce a small, steady supply of fresh oxygen. This creates a little oasis of life. These green weed beds are magnets for microscopic organisms, which in turn attract minnows and small perch. Suddenly, you have a concentrated buffet in 12 feet of water. A big pike or a cruising walleye knows this. They will leave the barren deep basin and set up shop right on the edge of these weed beds. They can breathe, they can eat, and they can ambush prey. Finding the last remaining green weed lines of the season is like finding the only restaurant open in a deserted town. Fish are lazy. They love edges. So, it's not always about just deep or shallow. It's about the transition zones between them. When fish move out of the suffocating depths, they don't just randomly swim into the shallows, they follow structure. The first major drop-off from a shallow flat is a perfect example. A walleye might spend its day cruising that edge, say in 15 to 20 feet of water. It has easy access to the shallow, oxygen-rich feeding flats, but also the security of slightly deeper water nearby. Other key transition zones are the edges of those weed lines we talked about, or a change in bottom composition, like where a soft, muddy bottom turns into gravel or sand. These edges are natural highways for fish, and that's where you should be setting your traps. You absolutely cannot fish the same way all winter. Your strategy must change. Let's break it down. Early ice, which is usually late November through December, is different. The lake is still full of oxygen from the fall turnover. During this time, the fish might still be relating to those classic deep structures, and the fish deep rule can work. But then comes midwinter, January and February. This is the toughest time. The snow is deep, blocking sunlight. Oxygen levels are at their lowest point for the year. This is when the deep basins are most likely to be dead zones. Your focus has to shift to shallow weeds and structure. Then, as late ice approaches in March, the melting snow and lengthening days start to pump new oxygenated water into the shallows first. The fish will move even shallower, preparing for the spawn. Using a midwinter strategy during late ice is a huge mistake. Let me give you a real-life example that burned this lesson into my brain forever. I was on a popular local lake, maybe mid-January. It was a weekend, and there were probably 50 guys out there. Every single one of them was clustered over the lake's main 45-foot basin. It looked like a small village. I talked to a few guys, and nobody had a single flag all morning. I looked at my map and saw a large, shallow flat, about 12 feet deep, with a sharp drop-off on one side. It was a good 200 yards away from everyone else. I went over there, drilled a line of holes right on that edge, and set my tip-ups. Before I even had the fifth one set, the first one went off. A nice 30-inch pike. I ended up getting 3 pike and a decent walleye in about 2 hours, while the village in the middle of the lake got nothing. They were fishing in a graveyard. If you have electronics, like a flasher or a fish finder, they will prove this to you. Stop just using them to check the depth. Drop your transducer in the hole and pay attention. In those deep basins, you will often see a void. The screen will be blank from, say, 25 feet all the way to the bottom, but then you'll see marks, a lot of them, suspended high up in the water column at maybe 15 or 20 feet. Those are the fish. They are stacked up just above the dead zone in the last layer of breathable water. Your flasher is literally showing you the invisible oxygen line. If you drop your bait below those marks, you're wasting your time. Trust your graph. It knows more about what's happening right now than a fishing rule from 1952. Now, let's not forget about the other variables. Barometric pressure still has a huge effect on fish behavior, even under the ice. Think of it like this. On a stable, high-pressure day, when the weather is nice and settled, fish tend to be more confident and will roam more freely. These are the days they might be right up in the shallow weed beds, actively hunting. But when a storm front is moving in and the pressure is dropping, they can get a little spooky. They might not go back to the dead zone depths, but they will pull back to the closest available cover or structure. They might tuck in tight to the deep edge of that weed line, or sit right on the lip of the first drop-off. They're still in the oxygen-rich zone, but they're holding a little tighter to their safety spots. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, and the main exception here is lake trout. If you're specifically targeting lakers, then yes, you need to be deep. Lake trout are a completely different animal. They are a cold water species that evolved in deep, clear, oxygen-rich lakes. They need that cold water to thrive, and they will stay in the depths all winter long. But the key phrase there is oxygen-rich. They are typically found in lakes that are deep, clear, and low in vegetation, so the oxygen depletion isn't as severe. But for the vast majority of us who are chasing walleye, pike, perch, and bass, applying a lake trout strategy to our local reservoir is a recipe for a long, cold, fishless day. Know your target species and know your lake's characteristics. This all means you have to rethink your whole drilling strategy. Stop walking out to the middle of the lake and just drilling a random grid. That is inefficient and based on a bad assumption. Instead, start thinking structurally. Work from the shoreline out. Start in a promising area, like near a point or an inside turn. Drill your first hole in, say, 8 feet of water. Then drill a straight line of holes out towards the basin, spacing them out every 20 or 30 yards. One hole in 8 feet, one in 12, one in 15, one in 20, one in 25. Then set your tip-ups along this line. This approach lets the fish tell you where they are. If you get all your flags in that 12 to 15 foot range, you've found the active zone for that day. You can then concentrate your efforts there. Another thing to look for are lifelines. These are areas that bring fresh, oxygenated water into the lake system. Even a tiny trickling inlet creek can make a huge difference. That moving water is full of oxygen. The area around that inlet will be a magnet for all kinds of life. Springs are another gold mine. If you know a lake has underwater springs, they can create pockets of better water quality and slightly warmer temperatures. These spots are often overlooked, but can be the hottest spot on the entire lake, especially during that midwinter slump when the rest of the lake is getting stagnant. A little bit of current or fresh water can turn a mediocre spot into a 5-star hotel for winter fish. You cannot be afraid of fishing too shallow. I know it feels wrong, especially when you're used to fishing deep, but I can't tell you how many huge pike I've pulled from 6 or 7 feet of water in the middle of January. It seems crazy. You can practically see the bottom. But if there is cover, like a fallen tree or a thick patch of weeds, and there are baitfish present, a big predator will absolutely be there. In these super shallow situations, you have to be stealthy. Noise and vibrations travel easily through the ice. Your shadow passing over the hole can spook a fish, but don't let the depth number scare you off. If the right ingredients for life are there, the fish will be there, regardless of what the depth finder reads. Here's a more advanced tip for you. Learn to read the snow cover on the ice. This isn't some old fishing myth. It's based on science. Sunlight is the engine for oxygen production in those green weeds. If you have a thick, uniform blanket of 2 feet of snow across the entire lake, very little sunlight gets through, and those weed beds will die off and start to decay, consuming oxygen instead of producing it. But if you have areas with less snow, maybe where the wind has blown it clear, more sunlight can penetrate the ice. This can keep a small weed patch alive and producing oxygen longer into the season. It can also slightly warm the water by a degree or two, which is a huge deal in winter. Finding these brighter spots under the ice can lead you to hidden pockets of activity. Let's talk about the second drop-off trap. So many fishermen find that first, obvious steep drop-off, and they focus all their effort there. They see the line on the map go from 10 feet to 30 feet in a hurry, and they think, this is it. and sometimes it is. But very often, the fish are not using that main primary break line. They are relating to more subtle secondary structures. Maybe there's a smaller, less obvious drop-off on the big shallow flat itself, a place where it goes from 8 feet to 12 feet, or a small underwater hump or point that doesn't look like much on the map. These subtle pieces of structure can hold huge numbers of fish who are avoiding the more obvious, high-traffic areas. Don't just look for the biggest, steepest drop. Look for the little things. Then, just when you think you have it figured out, everything changes again. Late ice is a whole new season. As the days get longer and the sun gets stronger, the snow on the ice begins to melt. This meltwater is cold, but it is supersaturated with oxygen. It runs down your old holes and through cracks in the ice, and it reoxygenates the shallow water first. This is a massive signal to the fish. It's like opening the windows in a stuffy house. The fish, especially species like pike and walleye that spawn shortly after the ice melts, will push into these newly refreshed shallow areas in huge numbers. They're staging for the spawn. If you're still fishing out in 25 feet of water during this period, you are in the wrong place at the wrong time. You've missed the final, and often best, bite of the season. I want you to try a simple experiment. I promise this will be an eye-opener. The very next time you go out ice fishing, I want you to rig your tip-ups as a test. Set your normal spread. Maybe you have 4 or 5 tip-ups. Put most of them where you normally would, in that deeper, comfortable water you've always fished. But take just one, only one, and set it ridiculously shallow. I'm talking 8 to 12 feet of water. Put it right on the edge of some old dead-looking weeds, or near a beaver lodge, someplace you'd normally walk right past. Then just sit back and watch. I'm willing to bet that your single shallow tip-up will outfish all the others combined. That one flag will teach you more than 10 years of doing the same old thing. The results will absolutely shock you. So what's the big lesson here? The lesson is not always fish shallow. That's just trading one bad rule for another. The real lesson is to learn to adapt. It's about stop assuming and start observing. The lake is telling you a story every single day through the weather, the snow cover, and what your electronics are showing you. The fish are telling you a story with every flag that goes up and every flag that doesn't. Your job as an angler is to learn to read that story and react to it. Stop just going out and doing what you've always done because it's comfortable. The best fishermen are the ones who are constantly questioning, constantly testing, and willing to abandon a spot that isn't working, even if it's their favorite honey hole. True success comes from adaptation, not repetition. So, let's wrap this up. The biggest takeaway, the one thing I want you to remember, is that deep water in the winter is often a trap. It's a barren, oxygen-starved desert. The invisible factor of dissolved oxygen is the true king, and it dictates where the fish will be. And more often than not, that location is shallower or higher in the water column than most people think. The aha moment, the real turning point, is when you stop thinking purely in terms of depth and start thinking in terms of habitat. A living weed bed in 12 feet of water is infinitely better than a dead, mucky hole in 40 feet. This one shift in mindset can, and should, completely change your winter strategy, from where you park the truck to where you drill your very first hole. Thank you so much for watching. If this video gave you a new perspective, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on more tips that challenge the old way of thinking. Now, for the comments, I want to know, what's the one old rule about fishing that you've discovered is totally wrong? Share it below. Let's start a conversation.